Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for the good night's sleep and another day of work and study. Dear Lord, we ask that you be with us here this morning, surround us with your angels, shut us in with you now, that we may behold wondrous things out of thy law. Bless Brother Jeff as he presents the things we need to understand. May every mind and heart in this room and around the world feel and be touched by the truths that we need to know for a time such as this. We ask and pray these things. We thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen.
The reason that I'm looking at presenting this illustration of the 7 churches of Revelation, both typifying the Christian church and the Hebrew church, is because of the consideration about whether there is actually 2 generations within our generation. And that has a bearing when we start considering the sign of Jonah, because the sign of Jonah in the scriptures is placed in the context that it's a message for a wicked and adulterous generation. So when you look at the scriptures in time of Christ and Sister White's commentary, it appears to me there's a distinction between 2 classes of people that are hearing this message that's typified by the sign of Jonah. And I'm saying those are 2 different generations, whereas others are saying it's all one generation. So in our history, when the sign of Jonah becomes an issue, and you have an argument that that symbol, that sign, is for everyone, and there is no distinction between this class or that class, it contributes to an overall theme that is coming out of this prophetic model that I first got confronted with in Wales. And it's not just on the parable of the wheat and tares, nor is it just on this, but there's other lines that are put into this. One that we've mentioned is that the new movement and the new organization that is mentioned in the Alpha Omega apostasy is all just right there in one group of people. Okay, one group of people possesses both of these movements. This group of people is just one generation with no distinction. And if you try to see a distinction between the wheat and the tares, then you're placing yourself in the position of a wicked servant that is accusing the brethren, because you're suddenly making a distinction between him being a tare and him being a wheat. And at one level, what I'm saying is that is the argument of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, when they're saying that the whole congregation is holy. There's no distinction between anyone in this congregation. We're all the same. That can be done in a variety of ways. So if there is a distinction between these 2 generations, then a teaching that says, no, everyone in our generation, all the priests, whether they're wise or foolish, are the wicked and adulterous generation, it's the opposite of saying everyone is holy, but it has the same results. It's defining everyone in the same basket. So we're looking at this because to me there's no way. I don't really remember when, but I know where I first learned this particular teaching. I know who I learned it from, a brother in London. I have a hunch he was putting this in the record before the year 2000. Okay, so this is an old understanding. And every time I've dealt with it, I've realized there's so many gems in here that haven't been recognized or dealt with. I still feel that way. There's a lot of issues that are addressed with this. But what we're saying, and we didn't do a real thorough presentation of this, our argument is to get us back to where we were the other day, is that in the book of Zechariah in chapter 1, you can see these horses that lead to the question of how long. And in the seals, you have the 4 horses that lead to the 5th seal and present the question, how long? And yesterday we closed out taking time with about 5 or 6 references in the scriptures where you can show that how long is a question that leads to the answer, which is the Sunday law. But each of those answers will give a different understanding of the Sunday law, a different emphasis. So we were putting the how long right in here after Thyatira. And we have a classic passage that we use in this movement that everyone's familiar with. That being that Thyatira represents the 1260 years, and that Sister White compares the 1260 years to the 70 years of the Hebrew church. And then in Zechariah, the question, how long, comes right here. Same place it's supposed to come, the same place it comes over here. And so you can do it, just pretty simple logic now. What led into the 70 years captivity for ancient Israel was the history of these kings, okay? What I'm saying is the history of the judges leads up to the history of the kings. And it's the king's compromise in this history with idolatry and the other nations that lead to the 70 years captivity. Here we have a symbolic king, Constantine. Now he doesn't cover this whole history, but he's the symbol of this history because he makes the compromise between Christianity and paganism. That's been typified by the compromise that went on with these kings that leads to the captivity that's been typified by this captivity that led to the question, how long, that led to this question, how long. So here, I've argued for a long time, it doesn't matter, but if you go to Book of Judges, I argue that the theme in the Book of Judges is a statement that you find in there, in the Book of Judges, at least twice, maybe 3 times, but I think it's at least, I'd go with twice until someone corrects me, and I didn't think about going to this, so I don't know that I can turn right to it, but there's a statement in Judges towards the end, and I think also towards the beginning, where it says, and they did every man did what was right in their own mind. Pardon me? Yeah, that's the last statement, but I think it's even mentioned earlier on. The verse 25 of chapter 21, 25. There's some symbols for you, huh? In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And that's in there in Judges in another place too.
Yeah, it's just shortly before it.
Okay, so the point I'm making here is if you go into particularly Stephen Haskell's book called the Seer of Patmos, when he deals with the Smyrna time period, the persecution of which there is no condemnation, he points out that there was a misguided zeal in this history, and there was people that were pretty much pushing themselves into the position of being martyrs. They were taking it upon themselves to be martyrs just for the sake of being martyrs. And there were genuine martyrs, but there was this kind of misguided zeal in that regard. I guess there's no other way I know how to say it. But I would link that up over here, is that the summary of the book of Judges is everyone was doing what they thought was right in their own mind. Okay, but it's before the time period of the kings, and the kings are the ones that are compromising, that are going to lead you into 70 years of captivity, just as Constantine did. But Ephesus in this history is the time period of Moses. All right, so that's what I have up here. Ephesus being Moses, but Ephesus being Laodicea, being this history here for the Hebrew church. So Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. So you've got an argument there that the beginning of ancient Israel is going to be repeated at the end of ancient Israel. So the time of the end for Moses is the birth of Aaron and Moses. Okay, for years we've just put the birth as one person, and maybe it is. I hope I'm not moving any foundations for anyone, but now we see at the time of the end more often than not there's 2 personalities marked. So that time of the end for Aaron and Moses would be typifying the time of the end in Laodicea, which is the history of Christ. So it would be typifying the birth of John the Baptist and Christ here at the time of the end. Message formalized. For Moses, that would be. And for the time of Christ, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Okay. And then the foundation in the time of Christ is the baptism. This is where he's taking 2 of John's disciples and selecting 3 new disciples. And with those 5, Sister White says they represented the foundation of the Christian church. And in the time of Moses, that would be the Sabbath. He comes back into Egypt and he introduces the Sabbath. And the history there is about going out and worshiping in the wilderness. And the Sabbath is the foundation of all true worship. And this history leads to Passover for Moses, the cross for Christ, both followed by a disappointment. Did I spell disappointment right? It seems like it has maybe too many P's. Anyway, it's probably so small you can't tell, so it don't matter. All right. So, Ephesus in the history of the Hebrews is illustrating Laodicea in the history of the Hebrews. We understand that in Millerite history, these 3, at one level, these 3 churches are contemporaries to each other. So we can probably, and we know it's the same with us. In our history, there will be three groups of people that are being dealt with. The class that is, like for us right now, the people that are being dealt with are the priests. And you're going to have Philadelphian priests and Laodicean priests, and they're going to have a message to carry to the Sardisians. Okay. And then in the same when the movement moves into the Levites, you're going to have Philadelphian Levites, Laodicean Levites, and the 11th hour workers. And Sardis can be defined as those that escape. And in Daniel 11:41, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, the 11th hour workers, escaped the hand of the papacy. So there's probably a way that you can mark all 3 of these entities in the history of Moses and in the history of Christ, the beginning and end of ancient Israel. So there's all kinds of things that you can do there. But when you take the 7 churches representing the history of the Hebrew church, and you maintain the understanding of the 7 churches being the history of the Christian church, then you see, in a terminology that we would use, 2 sticks being joined here. All right, that may be the wrong way to say it, but you see an overlap of these 2 churches. This history here is the beginning of the Christian church, and this is the end of the Hebrew church. But they're contemporary. And it's just amazing that the characteristics of Ephesus in the time of Moses is repeated in the time of Christ, but it's also repeated in the time of, I guess I got to say Christ, here in the Christian church. And it's going to be repeated down here in our history. Okay, so in the time of Christ, it's going to be these same characteristics that we laid out, but you have 2 churches. You've got one that's coming to a conclusion and one that's starting. I'm arguing that it's 2 different classes of people. Okay, so let's go. Let me think if I want to put anything else in that. Okay, and one other thing. We know that at one level, as Seventh-day Adventists today, we're living in the history of Laodicea. And this is what I'm going to say here is really key to this Omega prophecy. Okay, we're living in the time period of Laodicea, therefore we should be repeating the time period of the Millerites. Okay, because the beginning of Adventism is going to typify the end of Adventism. So at that level, the beginning of Adventism would be Ephesus, and ours would be Laodicea, approaching it this way. And therefore the movement, the Millerite movement, I'll probably get things confused here. I'm dealing with this now in a third way. Now I'm saying these 7 churches are illustrating the history of Adventism. Not the Christian church, not the Hebrew church, but the history of Adventism. So now I'm arguing that Ephesus for Adventism was the Millerite history, and you're going to have the same characteristics in the Millerite history that you had in the history of the first Christian church in the time of the disciples, that you had in the history of Moses at the beginning of the Hebrew church, that you had in the history of Laodicea for the Hebrew church, and that all 5 of those histories, 1, 2, 3, all 4 of those histories typify our history. Therefore, in our history, we're going to have a time of the end. We're going to have a message formalized, an empowerment and a foundation that goes to the Sunday law. And we all get that, right? But what this is teaching us, the Hebrew and Christian church, is the lesson about the Lord entering into covenant with people. Okay, when he's entering into covenant with people, even back here in the time of Moses, he enters in covenant with the people he brings out of Egypt. He puts them through a 10-step testing process. And when they fail that 10th test, when Joshua and Caleb and the 10 spies come back, the first covenant people have just failed that 10th test. They're going to die in the wilderness before anyone goes in the promised land. So Joshua and Caleb become the symbol of the new covenant people. And what all I'm getting at is when the Lord's entering into covenant with a people, he's simultaneously passing by a covenant people. That goes on in this history. That goes on in this history. He's passing by Laodicea of the Hebrew church when he's entering into covenant with Ephesus of the Christian church. And Ephesus of the Millerite history, he's passing by Protestantism while he's entering into covenant with Adventism. And these lessons come down here. He's passing by Adventism and entering into covenant with the 144,000, as long as we understand there's a qualification in what the 144,000 technically means. So I wanted to put that covenant element in there before we return to 1 Peter chapter 2. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. Verse 3, and for a long time, this is how I'm going to go over these verses, is how we've had it in the public record. If there's some discrepancy on this, then we need to have those discrepancies pointed out so we can correct them. But verse 3 says, "If so be ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed a deed of men, but chosen of God and precious, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." Now, few years ago, we began hearing in this ministry that if you go to, keep your finger in 1 Peter, but go to Ezekiel chapter 2. And verse, we should read all of chapter 2 and 3, but I want you to go to verse 8. It says, "But thou, son of man, Hear what I say unto thee. Be not thou rebellious like that rebellious house. Open thy mouth and eat that I will give thee. And when I looked, behold, a hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein, and he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations, mourning, and woe. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest, eat this roll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. Okay, we had understood that both in 1 Peter 2, that when you have tasted, means you have eaten the message of 9/11. And we had understood that this was also the case in Ezekiel 2 and 3, but there began to be an argument, that said, no, this eating doesn't take place at 9/11, it takes place at midnight. And while that was being presented here, we pushed that back and it didn't get established here. But it was being sounded here on a regular basis, that these references to when we eat the little book are not really identifying 9/11, they're identifying midnight. Okay, so people aren't aware of it because the kind of discussions where we were hammering out differences of opinion in this ministry weren't necessarily going out over the internet or going out in newsletters, but those of us that are still here remember those kind of arguments. So I'm going back to 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm saying that until otherwise directed, that this is identifying that at 9/11, when the angel comes down and he has the hidden manna in his hand, that we are to take that hidden manna and eat it. And at that point, in verse 5, we're built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, marking the time period of the priest testing process from 9/11 to midnight. And in verse 6, wherefore also it's contained in the scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Unto you, therefore, which believe, he is precious, but unto them which be disobedient, the stone that the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, even to them that stumble at his word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. And what I'm saying is that for our history, this is 9/11. When the angel comes down, we have to take the little book and eat it. We are now identified as priests. Okay, and I found a really nice quote the other day looking for something else, looking up hidden evil. And there's a passage in there where Sister White says, we enter into, this isn't word for word, but it's very close. It's something we already knew, but she says it black and white. She says, we enter into covenant with the Lord, and then he tests us, okay? And that's what we understood is here we're entering into covenant as priests. Whether we understood it or not, we were being called to be priests, and we began eating the little book, but we're going to be tested with the 3-step testing process. And the test is going to be over the foundation, the cornerstone. And this is going to produce 2 classes of worshipers, according to Peter, obedient and disobedient. And Peter's almost, when you read this, it's almost like predestination. But we don't believe in predestination, do we? So don't say that I'm saying that. But in verse 8, it says, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. It's like they were appointed to stumble. But definitely, there's 2 classes of worshipers here. So what I'm saying is, and this isn't really challenging any of the things that I'm saying about the Omega or the truth in opposition to Omega. We know here that now we're called to be priests, we're being tested, and we're either going to be foolish priests or wise priests, okay? But the next verse says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So, this will be a dumb question, but go ahead and answer it. Who wrote this? Peter. When did he write it? And I don't know the year that he wrote this, but let's just do some sanctified reasoning. When did he write this? Let me ask it this way. Did he write it after AD 70? Okay, so he would have probably written it before the destruction of Jerusalem, but we're open for correction on that, right? Okay. So the next verse is what I want you to see. It says, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which have not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles. So what is Peter saying there? Who's he speaking to?
Should I read what my Bible says about that?
Okay, maybe.
It basically says this, the precise date of the writing of this epistle cannot be determined. The letter was written probably from Rome, as the name Babylon suggests. See chapter 5:13. This would mean that it was written near the end of the apostle's life. The absence of any reference to Peter's presence in Rome in Paul's letter from the city suggests that Peter did not arrive there until about the time of Paul's final arrest, about AD 66. So they're saying somewhere in that airtime area.
Just before the destruction of Jerusalem, they're guessing, but
Close to Sesame.
the point I'm wanting to make here is, who is he writing to? Is he writing to the Hebrew church or the Christian church? He's the Christian church, and what does he say to the Christians there in verse 10? Before this history, you were not the people of God, but you have now become the people of God. And then in verse 12 he says, keep your conversation honest among the Gentiles. Who was the Christian church being made up of? Jews and Gentiles. So now he's saying this Christian church, even though it's been composed of Jews and Gentiles, that they are now, there's a distinction being made between them and those outside of them. Those outside of God's church are Gentiles. So he's nailing down that the Lord was entering into covenant with this group, even though they were contemporary with this group, and this group was being passed by. And the reason this group is getting passed by is because they stumble over the foundation. Right? Okay, so if you go to Isaiah, yes.
When is the end of Laodicean church for the Hebrew church?
Never thought that one through positively, so I may be hanging myself out to dry, but I would say AD 66 to 70, it comes to an end. The destruction of Jerusalem. At one level, the destruction of Jerusalem is identifying when the structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is swept away.
Yeah, couldn't you apply that 490-year prophecy there as well?
To 8034?
That was the end of
Yeah, he's
Jews,
divorced.
God's people.
He's divorced him there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, because if you get into it, you can see that the reason that the Lord allowed the punishment of Jerusalem to go out to AD 70 is he was giving the children of the Jews that hadn't been held accountable to the light that the Jews had rejected opportunity to make their own choices. So it was, in mercy, extended that period of time. But if you allow for that, you can move the destruction of Jerusalem back to AD 34 and say that's where it ends. Is that addressing your question, my brother?
Yeah.
Okay.
80:34, we're told by Sister White, was actually the separation, but the Lord had given the children of that generation. So then you have the 3 and the 4 generation almost like connected. we were doing 3840, like you were saying, a generation connected with another generation.
Okay, so let's go to Isaiah 28. And we have understood, I mean, you know, I think I said something a couple days ago, and I think some people thought that I was saying it about something that I had heard recently. And I realized this morning that's probably, I had a conversation afterwards. It's probably where I heard it from. But I was accused of moving the foundations because of the darkness between 1957 and 1989 a couple months ago. Okay, so I may have been accused since then by other people, but this is a charge that's been coming up for since I started admitting that there's a darkness in there. The point being is, I'm starting to wonder what it is that we get to identify as foundational. Okay, is foundational something that has to be 20 years old of understanding, or can it be 1 year old and still be foundational? It's kind of when people are talking about moving the foundations, either I'm moving the foundations or perhaps they're moving the foundations. What is it that qualifies as a foundation that and you gotta, brothers and sisters, you gotta know, because you need to know, because Sisters White is clear that we have a responsibility to defend and protect the foundations. If we don't know what they are, how can we fulfill our responsibility? Okay, so I'm raising a valid question here. What is the foundations?
I just had a conversation with Brother Partminder about our time at the end, and we know that there's a war between 1979 to 1989.
Does this have to do with what we're doing?
What you're talking about having, moving the foundation.
Okay, go ahead.
So we were discussing that there was actually two wars at the beginning of the time at the end that began prior. So you have 1979 to 1989, and then you have 1981 to 1991. And so you have these two proxy wars that went on that had to be fought over the king of the south. And the question came, well, what happened in 1991 in order for us to establish that there was actually 2 points, just like we see in the time of Jesus, in the time of Moses, and the time of Medo-Persia. And in 1991, the historical librarian made the Lest We Forget, which was basically taking us back from William Miller all the way to 1888. And the parable of the workers, that gives you 5 different specific groups you have to take in consideration. So then it would have to take you back before 1989. You don't think I'm dealing with the subject?
I don't know. I'm trying to wrap my mind around where you're going with this and see how it connects.
It's just that we're discovering there's 2 weight marks. There's two specific things like we find in the other histories.
Okay, so without knowing all of that, the implications, I get the point that you have 2 wars in that history that are coming to a conclusion at 89 and 91, and that has to mean something for us. Would that be, this isn't where I was going, but would that be foundational?
You have 2 or 3 testimonies to it.
So that's what you establish foundational on, is 2 or 3 witnesses? Because I would have thought foundational is something that has to do with the beginnings, and we sure didn't see that at the beginning.
Repeat and enlarge. Isn't that how the
Yeah, but okay, you may be missing my point. Foundational seems to be something like that is the beginning, and you're going to put pillars on it, and you're going to put a roof on it, and you're going to put a wind chime on the top of it all. And all those things are important. The roof and the pillars are important, but the foundation is typically defined as something distinctly different, even than the pillars. And so if we got to guard the pillars and foundations, we should know what they mean. Sister Carol.
I would think it would mean something that's been established at the beginning, like the charts were established at the beginning. They're our foundations.
Yeah, I would think that too.
I was just saying, the first chart is the foundation, and the other one is built onto.
Well,
Yeah, this chart here has the pillars with it.
Yeah, but that was the foundation, and this was added.
So in Millerite history, the foundational work is represented by this chart. So in our history, I would argue that it is these two charts, because when we came to an understanding, at least partially, about what these two charts represented, it was right here after 9/11 when we were returning to the old paths, right?
The Lord always works on the premises of two testimonies or two witnesses. Always. He always has. Always will.
Yeah, that's his character. So what's the point?
So in the courtyard, when you're dealing with the temple, building up in the courtyard, you have two items. You have two items. That's all you have.
Okay.
So you have to have a number two. You can't just work on the premises of one. The Lord never does that.
I don't know what you mean, though. I don't get your point.
But to prove something, you need to have two witnesses.
Yes, everyone, if you agree that we need two witnesses to establish something, say amen.
Yeah, so the foundation,
All right.
the foundation, to have the premises of a witness for the foundation. One. Just having one is not enough.
Okay, so you're saying that the 1843 chart was not enough to establish the foundations in the Millerite history?
Well, if it would have been enough, it would have left that way, but the Lord writing the 1850. At one level, we have to combine those histories to understand the whole history.
Okay, so now, I would say, based on what we've understood in the past, Sister Tanya is moving the foundations of the Millerite history, because she's where we've placed it in the production of the chart in May of 1842. If I'm understanding her right, she's saying that it can't be established until the 1850 chart comes into history, and therefore you have to move the foundations even beyond the pillars that were set up in 1844 to 1850. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that at the level that we're entering, because we know that the history of the Millerite will be because it did not perfectly fulfill the three angels' message. So that history will be repeated. So I'm saying in order for you to get the perfect fulfillment, you have to overlap them, you have to mix them together. So for you to see what will really happen. So at one level, yeah, it stands, it's true. But at another level, it has to be mixed together for you to have that perfect fulfillment.
If I understand the 43 chart correctly, they were the studies of Miller's that came before 1840, and they sort of just got put on a chart and sort of ratified, I guess you could say, or put in stone.
Established.
They were established, yeah, that's a better way to say it. So I would say anything that comes before 9/11 is the foundational truth that gets established at 9/11, and now we're building upon that understanding, because you have to have an understanding confirmed to build upon it. You need to know its truth, and it has to be proven true for you to now put pillars on it and a wind chime and everything.
What about 1989 being the foundation? 96 maybe.
Yeah, that's what you're saying, is when Miller formalizes the message. When's Miller's message first go public? When's his first public presentation? 31. 1831. So in 1831, it's in the public record. 33, 34, he gets his double credentials. But you're saying, and this is how I understand it in terms of what you're saying, that this is the second witness to those foundational truths. Miller has put these truths in the public record in 1831. You're going a step further. I was taking your comment and trying to make a point about moving the foundations, and I really don't think you were trying to do that, but you can argue that this chart is the second witness based upon Miller's formalizing the message. And where else could you bring a argument from the temple to uphold that? When they're going to lay the foundation to the temple, what do they do before that time period?
They cut the stones out.
They cut the stones out in this history. Okay, Miller cut the stones out here. The Lord used Miller to cut the stones out here, and then they get laid with this chart. That isn't really where I wanted to go, but we went there. Okay, so let's go to Isaiah 28. And I'm sure that in verse 15, that that you can see the connection in verse 16 of 1 Peter chapter 2, but we're going to begin in verse 15. Brother Graham, would you read from verses 15 through 18?
Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and falsehood have we hid ourselves. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. Judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it.
Okay, so what I'm arguing here is that in verse 16 you can see a direct connection with 1 Peter chapter 2. All right. Does everyone see that connection? Okay, so I'm saying that with 1 Peter chapter 2, you have there might be a better way to represent it. You have a chosen generation that has entered in, it may not say it this way, but it's entered into the covenant of life. But it's being contrasted here in Isaiah with a generation that's entered into a covenant of death. I'm saying that in these passages, two classes are being identified, and let me put it this way. The Hebrew church, the last remnant of the Hebrew church is entering into a covenant of death. And when the overflowing scourge passes through, who's the overflowing scourge? Yeah, but for their history, who was it? Cestius Titus, AD 34, typifying that. When the overflowing passes through, they're going to die. But at the same period of time, the early Christian church is entering into a covenant of life, and they are a chosen generation, a peculiar people. Okay, and the same would be in the history of the Millerites. The Protestants are entering into a covenant of death, while the Millerites are entering into a covenant of life. And so too would it be down here with the 144,000 contrasted with Adventism that's getting passed by.
The covenant of death in the timeline of the Hebrews, could we say that this is the league with the Jews?
Probably, but it's so. But that would mean that they entered in with this covenant, a covenant of death. Back in 161, Christ is going to come almost 200 years before Christ comes on the scene. Right? And it's probably correct because they were entering into the covenant with pagan Rome, and pagan Rome is going to be the overflowing scourge. I just hesitate to say yes when we're dealing with the covenant of the League of the Jews now back at placing it at the Battle of Raphia. I want to think through the implications of answering yes to that before I say yes to that. Okay, and so it's the foundations that are it's the foundation test here that makes the distinction between these two covenant people in these histories. Okay, and I'm arguing that this is the last generation of the Hebrew church. This is the first generation of the Christian church. That there are actually two generations going on in here. And I'm arguing it, the reason I put this up here is because these two classes, and we know it, they're portrayed as I don't know how to say it, as dual. Okay, you got the wise virgins, you got the foolish virgins. You got covenant of life, covenant of death. You've got standing upon the foundation and stumbling over the foundation. You got the wicked, the wise. You got all those dualisms. Is that the right word? Contemporary opposites.
Contemporary. It means going together.
Yeah, going together, but I want to make sure that we see that the distinction is between the lost and the saved at the same time. So what I'm saying is, with all those contemporary dualisms, that why would we say they're all the same generation? These here are called a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy people. Are the foolish priests a holy people? You can't say that. Because you can't identify who wheat and tare is until harvest. All right, so it is claimed. Okay, so now I want to switch gears in. We will no doubt come back to this at another time.
Is Laodicea and Ephesus at the end there, is that a divorce and a marriage?
Yeah, there would be a divorce here, a marriage here.
Okay.
What does that do, though?
My question would be, is God divorces and then marries, so should...
Does he?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Are you just saying it because it makes sense to you? Or?
No.
Doesn't make sense.
No, the Christian church came prior to AD 34.
The Christian church came prior to AD 34.
Parallel kingdom.
Because I agree with you. I think the Lord divorces first before he marries. But Brother Bud is throwing into the mix that the Hebrew church is divorced in 34 AD. And when does the Christian church begin?
Probably the same time. A little prior.
He's chosen. When Jesus chooses his disciples at the beginning of his ministry, he's already bypassed.
This is the foundation of the Christian church back here in 31.
Exactly.
You're saying it is? Yes, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, Jesus.
Okay, he's laying the foundation of the Christian church here. But when's the marriage?
Probably Pentecost.
The very beginning.
The cross would typify the marriage at one level, wouldn't it? Because the triumphal entry typifies the midnight cry that concludes at the cross or concludes on October 22nd, 1844.
I was gonna say, I see that 34, they're bypassed or they're divorced, but can we not also mark it at his baptism when he bypasses the leadership? Because I think also in the timeline of Esther, we mark the divorcement of Vashti at 9/11.
Okay. I'm going to make an argument. I already made it once a couple of weeks ago. That on this subject, you can show that the Christian church doesn't get the name Christian until after AD 34. And when you get married, that's when the wife gets the husband's name. And this is very key to the application that's being used on the railroad depot vision, because there's at least two variations of the railroad depot vision out there in Adventism, but both of them talk about God's denominational people being swept away, and denominational means named. Okay, so the argument is that the railroad depot vision proves that Future for America and this movement gets swept away at the windstorm in the railroad depot vision. But my argument is this movement does not have a name and will not have a name until after the structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is swept away at the midnight cry. Okay, so it destroys that application of the railroad depot vision. It won't stop it. It will continue to be presented that way, but it destroys it.
The Millwrights got their name after 1844.
Right. They did. Yeah, I went through that in here. It's always the case. The Christians begin to be called Christians after AD 34, after he had divorced his previous bride.
Would the divorce be when Christ walked out of the sanctuary?
Well, I think what I'm hearing in here, and this is what I've always understood, is that the divorce is progressive. It's progressive. It's a progressive close of probation that's going on with the covenant people. I mean, when they crucify the Messiah, but still you got to go to AD 34 before they're stoning Stephen, and Michael stands up. Tanya,
Going
Carol?
to Abraham, the way he entered into covenant with the Lord, there were 3 steps. First, he had the sacrificial with the 5 animals. Then he had the circumcision, and then he had a name change. And then we can see a progressive 3-step movement before he actually completely.
Gets his name changed.
Yes.
I don't know if this is valid, but when you get a divorce, usually there's a waiting period unless you go to Las Vegas. But, you know, there's paperwork, you wait a certain period before it's finalized. So maybe you could look at that way.
I have a question. My question is God the one divorcing the church, the Hebrews, or the other ones? Or is it them divorcing themselves from God? Because the Jews, they said, we have no king but Caesar. So is it not them who are divorcing themselves from God?
Yeah. It's their activity that forces him to take that decision, but it depends on how you look at it.
I have understood an idea very interesting. It's like you can divorce a people, you can divorce a wife. Bible says upon two things, or
Adultery?
adultery or death. The adultery, what we can see is that with
Okay,
You can end a marriage.
yeah,
in English, I wouldn't think death is a divorce. But okay, I get your point, carry on. I might argue with you later when I hear your conclusion about
Okay.
death.
What you can I don't remember whether it's Ezekiel or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He had a woman who went by again and again worrying, but
Hosea.
she what?
Hosea. You think about Hosea?
I don't remember. He went
Hosea.
to for her again and again, and I think that Jesus says to us in the same manner we are worrying with the idols, but he comes again and again. And finally, what we can see with the churches, with the different churches, is that it's the death which marks the divorce, because the wife somehow will kill herself, or will mark a killing there, because in the time of Jesus, in AD 34, a killing is made, which marks the divorce. In AD in 1844, we can see a spiritual killing which is made also, which marks a divorce. And another another thing that we can say is that Christ, if he gives us the rules upon divorce and court or all these things, he himself must obey this truth, which means that he cannot go, as I understand, maybe I'm wrong, but he cannot go
Get another wife
get another wife
until the other wife's
married.
dead, is what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that he cannot court another wife while he is still married, which means that, as I understand, is like Christ came with a message to his church.
Okay, so yeah, so you're saying he couldn't be courting the Christian church at the baptism unless he'd already divorced that wife or she was already dead?
something like this. Why do I say this? Is that Christ's first intention was not to divorce his church. He came to present a message, and his intention was for her to accept the message. But in her refusing the message and killing him, she mocked her divorce. So from those of that church who accepted the message, Christ continues the covenant, or marks a new covenant, which means he merits that new church. And
Okay, if I'm understanding you correctly, then he's got to be fully divorced before the baptism. Or the church, the Hebrew church, has got to be dead before the baptism. And I'm not threatened by that, because we've already put in, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but we've already put in place that these three churches are contemporary with one another. And you got Sardis here, who has a name that it's alive, but it's dead. Okay, so when you're applying that to the Hebrew church, it may have a name that it's alive and already be dead before Christ begins courting the Christian church, raising up the foundation. That might be valid, because we're dealing with that all along, that it's a progressive close of probation, and like there's a passage where she plainly says in Desire of Ages that at his birth, at Christ's birth, the leadership was being passed by. So they're already being passed by at the time of the end. So if they're being passed by, it means they've done something prior to the time of the end that has already marked them as unfit. Okay? Spiritually dead. So, am I reflecting what you're saying correctly?
I think so.
Okay, we got it in the record.
From what I've heard this morning, it seems to me this comment has validity, because if you enter into a covenant with Rome, then you can't be married twice, biblically.
Yeah, well, that would be an adulterous relationship for sure. But they had lots of adulterous relationships throughout their history. That's what he's saying, and the Lord kept taking them back.
But it's specifically marked as a league, as a covenant.
That leads to the cross.
Yeah, so you could even say that that the divorce is 158.
161.
161 and 158, the chart.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to be careful about saying anything wrong on this chart. It's like this here. If you make a case that 538 actually find its fulfillment in 539, you're going to be railed against. Even though it's a foundational position, okay? Even though it's a foundational position, if you say that the fall of Babylon actually took place in 539, just a few days before 538 started on the Gregorian calendar, then you're going to be identified as moving the waymarks, moving the foundations. But the reality of it is that what we understood about the 2300-year prophecy is that prophecy comes into the Gregorian calendar in 1843 and 1844. Okay, and it's the same story here. The fall of Babylon, the historians are going to tell you, takes place just a week or so before the Karaite year of 538, and it fully qualifies. And this isn't a time prophecy, this is just a historical event. So the Millerites were correct about 538, but if you want to explain the history of 538 to someone thoroughly, and you're going to use the historical record, then you're going to have to go into the Karaite reckoning of time and let them know that 538 encompasses part of 539 and 538, and it's okay to teach it that way, and you're not attacking this chart. But that can't be seen by some that are very narrow in their definition of the chart.
Yeah, so in our line you could, and I don't know if this is right, I'm just throwing it out there, in our line you could argue that the Seventh-day Adventist Church gives a medal to the Pope and joins the ecumenical movement. And so what I'm trying
Which
to say
medal? They've given two medals.
Two, yeah. So when Christ comes, the comment was made, he came to save his church, yet they're a generation of vipers before his baptism. That means they're already serpents of the, they're already with Satan. I don't think he came so the church isn't the leadership. The leadership are done. He hasn't come, they won't allow themselves to be saved. Every man has to make his choice. So he's come to save people out of that serpent satanic leadership and to choose him. And yeah, he's already divorced. They're already divorced.
Okay, all right,
I'm sorry.
not a problem.
I'm just wondering how this fits into that scenario. Daniel 9:27.
Daniel 9:27.
And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate.
Okay, this is 27,
Right?
31, 34.
Right?
So what's that mean that you just read?
Well, I think he's confirming the covenant with the new, with the Christian church.
Everyone think that? Brother Nathan, is that how you understand it?
That he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week
Is the cross,
is the cross.
but this is only half a week. This is 1260. This is 1260. The week goes all the way to 34. So he's confirming the covenant with many for 1 week.
For 1 week.
Who's the many? Who's typically the many? The bad. So, is he confirming the covenant with the Christian church?
Yeah, I don't know if Bud is saying in the midst of the week, but he does confirm the covenant at that week or at the end of the week.
Well, I mean, if you're going to get to how the covenant's confirmed, he's confirming it with his blood. But my question is what covenant is he confirming? With what people?
The previous covenant with the Jews.
The previous covenant with the Jews. What does that mean?
To confirm a covenant, you've already have to have made a covenant.
Yeah.
And so he's going through the process again with the Jews, but they're going to deny him.
He's demonstrating.
And that's
their-
why
their guilt.
at the end of the week, their probation's cut off.
Okay, Brother Vadim?
Yeah, I want also almost the same thing. If he confirms a covenant, which it does mean that the covenant was made before, and he confirms it with those from the Jews who want to listen.
Oh, no, so you're saying different than him, but almost the same. But at 27 AD, the divine symbol comes down. We eat the little book, and what do? We enter into a covenant, but we're going to have a testing process. And where does he confirm the covenant? At midnight, at the cross. Okay, but who's he confirming the covenant for?
Jews and Christians.
That's what I would argue. He's confirming the covenant of life for one group, and he's confirming the covenant of death for another group. It's all based upon this foundation and how we relate to it. So there's two covenants being confirmed, the covenant of death and the covenant of life.
But if there is a covenant of death which is confirmed, where is the first covenant of death which was made? Because if it's confirmed, it has to be made before.
Throughout the Old Testament, the whole testimony
Isaiah
is.
28.
Pardon me?
Isaiah 28. Isaiah was talking to his own people then.
You can go back to Leviticus 26 even. It says blessings here and curses here. So,
Amen.
so what he's when you go to court and there's a controversy, you have to convert.
Why would you go to Leviticus 26?
Because
Because this whole history is marked as the 2520, so that would be a point of reference.
I'm also going to the beginning, to showing the end, or the end. So what I'm saying is that in Leviticus 26, the Lord set out clearly blessings and curses, and the Ten Commandments are either a blessing or a curse if you keep them. And clearly the Jews had broken them, and therefore they're so when you go to court using common law or Mosaic law, which is its foundation, you have to confirm the existence of the covenant or the contract before you can seek to enforce the penalties for its breach. And so when Christ is confirming the covenant with the Jews, they're going to have to pay the damages for the breach of their contract.
This week is a restating of the covenant in Leviticus 26, and with a pronouncement of either a blessing or a curse. He's confirming that covenant of death with those that have rejected it, but he's confirming a covenant of life with those.
One more point. The court requires you to enter into a negotiation to try and come to a settlement before the court makes a decision. So, Christ is coming and he's saying, listen, choose life or choose death, choose the blessings or choose the curses. And ultimately, it's the other party that chooses. Because he's not breached the covenant. They have.
It'd be based on their response. Sister Tamina, Sister Kathy, Sister Carol. Did you have your hand up?
Well, kind of.
Okay, well, I got you in after Tamina.
Thinking in the terms of the reform lines and in terms of the church structure, can we then say that the church structure is divorced at 9/11 because of all the symbols we have, like the leadership dying and things, and then the covenant with the new church structure, the marriage.
We used to teach that. Now there's a teaching that the whole church structure is governed by the times of ignorance and that they will be called as Levites. I don't accept that, but what you're saying is how we've understood it up until recently.
And then the marriage is at midnight cry, where the new church structure is married with Christ, getting married. So you have to divorce before he enters into this permanent relationship with the new church.
Yeah, I'm hoping what Brother Vadim is saying fits. They were already divorced before 1989.
Amen.
Sister Kathy?
Well, I see in the next verse in Isaiah 28, verse 18, well, first he said in 15, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death. And then in 18, and your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand, which reminds me of early writings 204 about the new organization, and they're making their own decisions, and it's not gonna. So he's confirming his covenant. They have their own covenant, is what I'm seeing, in their own mind.
Yeah, in this history though, both covenants
Yes.
get ratified. But it's either case, it's going to be all premised upon choice,
Right.
human choice.
Yes. And man over God here is what I see.
Sister Carol?
Jesus preached that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So the Jews decided to kill him, several years before he died on the cross. So the death really came about in their thoughts.
I want to put this in the record, even if we don't deal with it today. It's going to take me a couple minutes, but I don't care. I'll continue on. Tyler?
That's what I was going to ask you, is if you could squeeze that in.
Yeah, I'm going to squeeze that in, Lord willing.
Just because something clicked on me. We can, even though the the divorcing is marked with the death, I can see though it's a progressive divorcing because because when at his birth, when Christ came, you have a death also here with with the first for the child.
The children
The
that got
children.
murdered.
Yeah, they got murdered. So you have a death here. So you have the leadership divorced here. So I can see the progressive divorce, even though the divorce may be marked with death.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the leadership also in our time, by not accepting the message that it was given to them, they killed the message. So yeah, even for us, it's a progressive divorce. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think it is. I think you're right. Okay, let's go to Daniel 11. We have that in the record. We can come back to it. The thoughts. Daniel 11. Okay. I'm going to run by some things that we've studied here just real quickly to put them in place and to make a point. In verse 4 of Daniel 11, Alexander the Great's kingdom is divided into 4 parts. Ptolemy is controlling the southern kingdom. And then Seleucus, one of his generals, begins to conquer the 3 other areas. And he conquers the third one, the northern kingdom, in 301 BC, if I remember right. Don't hold me to dates. Okay, so we have applied that to represent 538 when the third horn is removed. It's typifying 538 when the third horn is removed and the papacy begins to rule for 1260 years. But in this history then, in verse 5 and 6 and 7, 8 and 9, through that history, once Seleucus becomes strong, there's going to be a peace agreement with Bernice in 252. Berenice. And ultimately she's going to get executed, and the king of the south is going to retaliate for that betrayal. And that was 35 years after 301, which would be what? Anyone know the year there? 271, 26. Anyway, all right. That 35 years, that history with the peace treaty of Berenice, just before the end of that history, is typifying the 1260 years of papal rule with the treaty of Tolentino in 1797, leading to the deadly wound of 1798. Okay, so Brother Vadim, who comes from one of the Soviet bloc countries and has probably a different insight to that culture than any of us in here, perhaps not counting Tanya. He has been grappling with verse 10. Okay, so we've got up to verse 9. You got 1798. The king of the south is pushed against the king of the north in 1798, and in 1989 there's going to be a retaliation. But that retaliation we have understood to be typified by verse 10 when it says, "But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through." This expression, overflow and pass through, is the same Hebrew words as Daniel 11:40. Overflow and pass over, it's translated in verse 40, but it's the same thing, the sweeping away of what we thought was the sweeping away of the entire Soviet Union in 1989. This verse, now that we see that this verse is typifying 1989, it adds a component that was never recognized before. "Then shall he return and be stirred up to his fortress." Okay, this here becomes the most pivotal verse in these verses. And whether you understand it or not, whether you've caught on or not, and I've acknowledged this and I understand this, okay, the struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south, it's external out in the world. But you can get into the history of the United States and you can see a struggle between the king of the south and the king of the north. And because you can do that, you're finding one class of people in this movement that they're placing all their emphasis on the internal struggle in the United States between the king of the south and the king of the north. And they're spending very little time with this external. Okay, that isn't where their focus is. And the thing that becomes interesting is on the internal in the United States, you can make a case that the king of the south is the United States. But in this external here, we're saying the king of the north is the United States. So you have to be careful about which line you're applying. And I'm just telling you that this particular verse is foundational to rightly dividing this passage. And therefore, the issue here with verse 10, he shall be stirred up even to his fortress, we're saying in the history that typified 1989, that they only came up to Egypt but not into Egypt. All right? And I'm saying that was what the Lord held his hand over in our history, and now he's removed the hand. We can see that what typifies 1989 shows that when the United States and the papacy sweeps away the Soviet Union in fulfillment of verse 40, that they don't finish off Russia, who is the king of the south. And this becomes an issue. It's probably the most important verse in here, whether you're going to settle that or not. Now, so here, what I want to argue here now, I hope you can see this. I know you can see it, but I hope you can see the logic of this, because I want to go further with this than we're going right now. 1789, the rights of man, a constitution, is introduced into France. Okay? But it's the identical year that the Constitution is introduced into the United States, and France typifies the United States. So you got 1989, you got two constitutions, two witnesses, Sister Tanya, that 1789 is typifying a constitution, whether it's the rights of man or the Constitution. And 3.5 years later, 4 years later, whatever that equates to 1793, a kingdom is removed, because this is where King Louis XVI's head's going to get chopped off. Okay, so at this waymark, 1793, and I got January 21st, 1793, this is a waymark about a kingdom being removed, because this is where royalty gets taken away in the French Revolution. But you know it's a waymark because Sister White is very explicit that exactly 250 years earlier, back here on January 21st, 1535, the first Protestant is killed as France turns against the Protestant Reformation. And I have some notes that I was going to hand out. I'm not going to hand them out till tomorrow because we don't have time to read them anyway. So I'm saying from 1535 until here, and Sister White points out, as the historians do, that this very first Protestant reformer that is executed on the same day, 258 years earlier, dies the exact place, the exact spot that King Louis XVI dies. There's no way that you can't see that is emphasizing a prophetic waymark, particularly when it's being identified in the Great Controversy. So this is a waymark, is what I'm saying. This has to be a waymark. And what happens here historically is a new dragon manifestation takes place. Because in 1793, when the royalty loses its head, for the first time in history, a communist government is put in place. Okay? But we know that the beast is always in Rome. And the false prophet, geographically, is always in the USA. Whether it's Protestantism or apostate Protestantism, it's always the USA and the papacies in Rome from beginning to end. But with the dragon moves through history. So this is marking a new manifestation of the dragon power, French Revolution. And it's going to migrate to Russia as the French Revolution sweeps across Europe. Because French Revolution, it was a domino effect across Europe, and it ends up in 1917 in Russia, identifying Russia as the new king of the South. So what I'm saying is, what has happened now, and the reason I'm saying that verse 10 is so key is, and I hope everyone understands, the dragon moves through history. He begins in heaven, he goes to Eden, he goes to Babel, he goes to Pergamus, he goes to Rome, France, Russia, and in the end he's going to end up in the United Nations. So the difference between the dragon, the difference between the beast and false prophet and the dragon is the dragon moves through history. These two powers are always in the same place. Okay, so in bringing this thought to a conclusion here, what I want to suggest to you here, now that Daniel 11 is being opened up, which I'm contending is the seventh seal, we have Paneum. And if verse 10 is being accurate, if we're applying that accurately, then here is where Russia, the king of the south, is removed. Okay? You will have to see a kingdom removed here. What I'm saying is, this is the arrival of the king of the south. All right? Before the French Revolution, you have the dragon power, and he's existing in all 10 of the pagan nations. Pagan Rome is disintegrated into 10 nations. So you can see him moving through history. But right here in 1793, this is the beginning of the King of the South in 1793. And at the beginning of the King of the South, you will have to have the same characteristics as the end of the King of the South. And from Daniel 11, we're identifying now that the end of this King of the South is Paneum. Russia is fully defeated at Paneum. Russia is going to somehow prevail, but when you get to the Battle of Paneum, Russia's gone, and that's based upon Daniel 11. It's a kingdom that is removed. So what you find is, there is a kingdom removed at the Battle of Paneum. There's a new dragon manifestation. New dragon manifestation, because now the dragon moves to the United Nations. Okay? The king of the south is Russia, is gone, and this is the beginning of the king of the south. This is the end of the king of the south. End, beginning. And this being defined as the midnight cry by the line of Daniel 11 suggests that right here, the persecution of the Protestant Reformation in here begins to be repeated as typified by this 258 years of that persecution. And from here, this is why this is down here. Because of the two witnesses, you have the Constitution of the United States down here. You have the first president, preceded by 10, preceded by 7. You have the Articles of Confederation here. And we're now being allowed, with this history here, to also plug this down here. You get here to the history of the final president, the 45th, and we should see this, he's going to transcend into the 10 and the 7. So what all all I wanted to put in the record here at this point is that because Brother Vadim wanted to understand the justification for saying that that Russia was still the king of the South after 1989, the justification is that the beginning of the king of the South has to typify the end of the king of the South. And the beginning of the king of the South, there is a king that loses his head. A kingdom is removed. Therefore, the marking of the end of the king of the South, you have to see a kingdom removed, and we do with Russia. And we have to see a new dragon manifestation, because that's what we saw here. It had changed from the 10 nations to France alone. The new dragon manifestation here is the United Nations. And here we have a king's head chopped off with the sword. And we have Revelation 13:10. He who lives by the sword is going to die by the sword. He who leads into captivity is going to go into captivity. So what I'm saying is Daniel 10:10 turns a light on that allows us to begin to put this history here into our history. And it confirms the understanding that it only goes up to the fortress of Egypt.
Daniel 11:10.
Oh yeah, what did I say?
Daniel 11:10. So 7 and 10, what's that again? The ark?
I didn't have time to go there. I'm saying that leave this all alone. This is about the French Revolution getting tied into our history. But because of what we understand about France typifying the United States, and for what we understand about the American Constitution in 1789, we got justification now for putting this line of the American Revolution, which shows 7 presidents leading to 10 presidents, leading to the Constitution, and bringing that down here in the same way that we're bringing the French Revolution down here. I'm saying that this is like the beginning of opening this whole thing up. And my argument is that it's the key to it is verse 10 of Daniel 11, and that Daniel 11 is typifying the world external view primarily, first and foremost, and that's what needs to be nailed down first and foremost. And that those of us that are seeking to put all our efforts into seeing the internal within the United States may at one level be trying to avoid the light of the 7th seal. I don't know whose turn it is to pray. Brother Jack, you want to pray?
Lord Heaven, we come to you this morning thanking you for being with us and waking us up and bringing us to this class. Lord, the marvelous things that are being opened up in front of our eyes, I just ask that you will help us to internalize each one of these things and remember them. Lord, I ask that you be with Tyler as he flies out today and give him safe traveling mercies. Be with each one of us as we travel from here. I ask you to be with Tanya tomorrow as she flies out also. I ask you to continue to watch over each one of us. And Lord, guide and direct our thoughts today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.